There's a lot of focus in our culture about the idea of last words. There's all sorts of, you can find articles and sometimes entire books that are just focused on the last words of various historical figures or celebrities. And some of them are kind of ironically almost funny in a way, but some of them are tragic, and some of them they are just simply expressing love for their loved ones and their family. But I think it's reasonable that there's a lot of focus on these last words. Because in some ways, it gives us such a clear, honest look at the hearts of the individual who gives these last words. Not a whole lot of point in dying or lying on your deathbed, you know? There's no point in telling lies. You don't got anybody left to impress because you're going to be gone. And so, in some ways, some of the most honest words we ever get from people are the last words they choose to speak in this life. And so today, in this lesson, we're going to focus on some last words. I know this VBS is about David, and spoiler for the end of the story, David dies at the end. And the Bible records his last words for us. So if you want to turn to 1 Samuel 23, we're going to spend some time looking at the last words of David. Because David's going to talk a lot in these words for us in a very poetic way, as David often does, about his life, about what he wants his legacy to be, about how he defines what success in life is versus what failure in life is. And as we know, David, a man after God's own heart, when he says, here's what a good life is, that warrants sitting down and taking a listen to it. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to ask David together, David, now that you've lived your great life with all the many successes you've had, what's it all about? And so if you're in, I said 1 Samuel, didn't I? We're in 2 Samuel 23, towards the end of David's life. 2 Samuel 23, and I'll give you a few extra seconds to turn there. And we're going to just start in verse 1 and just read all of David's last words together. I guess before we do that, I should make one note. David doesn't actually die until 1 Kings 2. So it's a little confusing. He says more words by the end of 2 Samuel. So you've got to decide what you're going to do with this. The text very clearly tells us they are his last words. So you can decide. Are they his last words and they just put them out of order in the text? Or are they maybe his last public words, his last inspired words? Whatever the case may be, it's very clear this is a much older David looking back on his life, telling his family, telling the nation, here's what I want you to know. All right, if you're with me in 2 Samuel 23, we're just going to start reading in verse 1. It says, "Now these are the last words of David, the oracle of David, the son of Jesse, the oracle of the man who was raised on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. His word is on my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The Rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. For does not my house so stand with God? For he has made me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. For will he not cause to prosper all my help and my desire? But worthless men are like thorns that are thrown away, for they cannot be taken with the hand. But the man who touches them arms himself with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they are utterly consumed with fire." And that's it. Those are David's last words. I want to take just a few minutes together this morning that we can really go through these in a little bit more detail and look at all that David's trying to say to us here. I just love that David starts these words, starts his last declaration with a reminder of who God is. He emphasizes that in verse 3, that God is the rock of Israel, that for the nation and for God's covenant people, all success, a good life, has to be built on their relationship with God. And so David starts these words by emphasizing his own relationship with God. Again, in verse 3, the Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. David's really trying to emphasize here that even though these are his last words, in a way they aren't just his words. He makes it very clear these are God's words as well, which adds even more emphasis for us to this text. These are the united message of God and His servant David, as David reflects back on his own life. And David's first instruction is very simple. Look again in verse 3 and into verse 4. When one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. In other words, if the king is good, life is good. And here, when David talks about good, he's not just talking about, the king being a nice guy or the king being someone who's pleasant to talk to. No, he's talking about someone who is righteous. A leader who cares deeply about God, who walks with Him, who lives in His truth. And David says, when you have a king, when you have a leader that cares deeply about God, it's good for everybody involved. The way he compares it to sunshine, to rain, these things that are essential for life on this earth, they're essential for any growth that's going to happen. If you think about a plant, right? What do they need? They need air, they need sun, and they need water. And David says here, essentially, for a people to grow, for a group to grow, it is essential for their leadership to follow God. And of course, that has many, many applications for us. Immediately here, David is talking about a king who follows God's law. But I don't think it takes too much of a leap for us to realize this doesn't just apply to kings. If you're an elder in the church, David says, hey, I need you to listen up. Because what I need you to be paying attention to is not all the day-to-day things that can really get you distracted. What I need you to be paying attention to is, are you truly humbly seeking God? If you're a parent, everything that you do has to be centered on this. I know that there's going to be ball practices, and I know that there's going to be this pulling you every which way, but David says, here, I need you to listen up. Here's what matters. Are you centered on God? And that can apply to any sort of influence or leadership we have. If it's in line with righteousness, if people can see the truth of God in our lives, then that's going to bring good things to everyone around us. So you may not consider yourself a leader. You may not have a fancy title. You may not be a boss of any kind. Maybe your kids are out of the house. But people are looking toward you. Other people in this room are looking toward you. And what David wants to focus us all in on, as he's lived his righteous life, is he wants you to look at your life. And he wants to say, am I exhibiting the truth of God in the way I live? Can people see that? We ask this question sometimes. If someone that knew nothing about you, they don't know you from anybody else, if they followed you around for a week, by the end of that week, would they know without you telling them that you were a Christian? Would they see in the way you interact with people? When somebody gets angry and upset at you, do you lash back at them or do you forgive them? Would they see that? Would they see in the choices you make by how you serve and who you serve? Would you have to tell them at the end of the week you're a Christian? Or would they just know by looking at you? Because Jesus tells his disciples, here's the way the world is going to know you guys from the rest of the world, by your love. That you have the same love that I have loved you with. And I think it's a very similar idea to what David is calling us to here. People should be able to see by the way you live. They should be able to see the light of God's truth. And David says, if you are in alignment with God's truth in the way you live, that's going to bring nothing but good things to those around you. And I think that'd be especially an important lesson as I imagine Solomon is sitting here listening to these words as David gives his final proclamation. It almost feels like you can see David looking towards his sons and saying, hey guys, this is for you. A good king listens to God. But then as David sort of continues on, he draws on the very words and promises of God. If you want to flip to 2 Samuel 7, I'm going to read a few verses from there. 2 Samuel 7 is where God establishes his covenant with David in a very similar way to where he establishes his covenant with Abraham. You'll notice some of the promises of God here are echoed in David's last words. Verse 11 and 12. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled, when you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Or skip down to verse 16 with me. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me, and your throne shall be established forever. And so, in David's last words here, he reminds his sons, but also the people, of the promises of God. Back in our text today, notice verse 5. David sort of says, here's how you should know that Solomon should be king after me. Verse 5, God has made with me an everlasting covenant. Of course, we can see from that the very obvious looking forward to the Messianic King Jesus who's going to reign forever. But David doesn't really get that yet. That's further down the line. So here, he's drawing on these promises of God. God promised that he would continue my royal line. And David affirms at the end of his life, we know that we can trust God's promises because they always come true. And David affirms that by drawing on his own past. Look at what he says. He says, look at what God has already done with me. He has made an everlasting covenant in verse 5. He is ordered in all things and secure. And then he says, will he not cause to prosper all my help and desire? Let me tell you what I see in that. In other words, God has always been there. God has been there from the very beginning of my life, arranging things and working them for good in my life. And of course we see that in David's life. You think about all the times David's been on the run, all the times his life has been threatened, all the way from when he was just a humble boy running from Saul, all the mighty battles that he fought, from bears and lions to Goliath to even towards the end of his life, even his own son. David's been through a lot. And he draws on that very idea to say, look, God has been with me from the beginning. He made a promise that he was going to establish my line, and he has been arranging things in the background, and now everything is in order. And so David says, of course I know that the rest of his promises are going to come true because everything he's ever said to me before has come true. God has always been with me, and he will never let me down. But then David sort of finishes these last words with kind of the opposite picture. Though it's good to be in God's people, though God is faithful to his people, and all who believe in God will be blessed, David says it's not good for the evil people. Verse 6, the evil are plucked and thrown away like thorns. But they're also like thorns in which they're too dangerous to handle. Verse 7, you can't pick them up because you're going to hurt your hands, so you got to use some sort of tool to get rid of them. It's the exact opposite picture of the godly leaders. Because remember, the godly leaders from earlier, they're like sunshine, they're like rain, they're like all sorts of good things. They make everyone around them grow. They bring them closer to God. And then David says, these evil people, to be around them is to bring pain to yourself. They're thorny. You can't touch them. You can't be too close to them. They're dangerous. That's why David here calls them worthless people in verse 7. They're worse than useless. They are going to bring you down with them. And so that's why David concludes his last words with the assurance that these evil people will be completely burned up right where they lie. David says, assuredly, God is going to take care of wickedness forever. These wicked people will not be allowed to destroy things forever. God's going to handle it. So you can see there's a lot of depth in these words. And I want to take just a few of our last minutes here to apply these words together. I think the main idea that runs through this entire section is how you define what it is to live a good life. The contrast of the lives of the righteous and of the wicked. David shows us the righteous, the wise people, they follow God. They love Him. They keep His word in justice. And so God establishes them and God blesses them. And He sort of says, here's the key to a good life. Make sure you're with God. Make sure you love God. If you love God, David says, you have everything and life is good. And that's made very clear by the second half where David turns around and looks at the wicked. And their life is terrible. Now that's not to say, David doesn't mean by that they're suffering and miserable constantly. It's very clear from most of the rest of David's Psalms. A lot of times the wicked prosper in this world, and he says that's unfair and it's terrible. But David's looking past that here. David's looking to the end of all things, and he says at the end, they're going to be burned up and they're going to be destroyed, and everyone that was associated with them is brought down by them. So when David lays out those two paths, it's very clear which one's a good life. The righteous are blessed and established by God. They inherit all of the promises that He has given them. And the wicked are burned up and destroyed. And when David puts it that way, it's obvious which one we want to live. It's obvious that the right path is to seek God. But the problem is that life, when you're living it, very rarely seems as obvious as David's words in 2 Samuel 23. They're words that are really easy to put on a t-shirt or a bumper sticker or whatever, but they're really hard to live out. And so I want to talk for just a few minutes about how we define success. Think again about David, right? From a worldly, earthly perspective, David is as successful gets. A rich king, a mighty warrior. Not even to mention the fact that he was a poet and a musician. I mean, David could do it all. And yet, when he gets down to the very end of his life and he's looking back on his life, he doesn't mention any of those things. David had every opportunity as he's giving sort of his last declaration to his people. Remember all the amazing things I've done for you. Remember all the successes we've had together. Hey guys, do you remember when I beat Goliath? That was pretty cool, right? He doesn't do any of that. He focuses on one thing. And that's that he had a relationship with God. And it seems that as David sort of narrows his focus on what matters in his life, even though there's lots of cool stories he could have focused on and he could have told, he really seems to only care about one thing. And that's that he was part of God's people. He kind of lets everything else lie where it is. David sort of acts like a salesman for God here, saying, you can have all these blessings too. You could have a great life too. All you have to do is to choose to follow God. But what about for ourselves? Everybody wants a good, successful life. I don't think there's anybody in here that would raise their hand and say, yes, please, I would like to be a failure. Nobody wants that. But how do we define a successful life? Let's think about it this way. I want you to imagine that when your life ends, you're penniless, you're homeless, you're jobless, all your friends and your family have abandoned you, you're sick, but you have a relationship with God. Is that a successful life? From the world's perspective, we would say no. But David says we need to recalibrate, because that is a successful life. Because if you have a relationship with God, you don't need anything else. Let's think about it from the other end. Let's say you got your dream job, you invested real well, you're a millionaire, you've got a big, beautiful house, everything is wonderful for you, but you don't have a relationship with God. Jesus calls that selling the whole world for your soul, and Jesus says that is a complete and utter failure. By earthly standards, it's about as successful as you could get. And yet, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter at all. David's point here is if you have God, you have everything. And if you don't have that relationship, you have nothing. Do you see how powerful that is? It's a complete 180 on the way we normally view life. It really comes down to where we put our ID. How do we identify ourselves? Because our identification cannot be in being an American or an Arkansan or wherever you're from. It's not in being white or black. It's not in being Republican or Democrat. It's not in our job. It's not in our skills. It's not in what we're good at. It's not in our stuff. It's not in what we've earned. It's not even ultimately in our family, as much as we may love them. When David looks at his life, he says, one thing matters. There's one way to identify yourself. Are you with God or not? All of the rest of those things, they can be valuable to us. There is definitely value in them. It's okay for them to be important to us. But they can't be who we are. Who we are people of God. Nothing more and nothing less. And that has to be how we identify ourselves. You know why? Because when you're looking back on your life like David is now, when you die, you know what's not going to matter anymore? You're not going to care about the politics of this world anymore. You're going to leave that behind. That's going to stay here. You're not going to care about how much was in your 401k. That's going to stay here. All of the things we focus so much time and energy on now, they're staying here. One thing continues on. There's one thing you get to take with you when you die, and it's the relationship you have with God. And so David says, if that's the only thing that you get to take with you, then you better make sure you're taking time now to cultivate that. That's what matters. And the beauty of that is that it's available to everyone. Because all those other things, you may never have your dream job. You may never even have your dream job offered to you. I can't guarantee you that. You may never have this X amount of money. You may never have this. You may never have that. I can't tell you if that's going to be available to you or not. But the one thing that will always be available, the invitation offered to everyone, is, are you willing to be part of the people of God? So I want to close thinking about, again, our lives. Where do we place our ultimate importance? Where are we focusing our time? When we are sitting, as much as you hate thinking about it, when we're on our deathbeds, when we're saying our last words, when we're looking back on our lives, are we going to look at our loved ones and say, I had my priorities right. I had God. That's what mattered. Or are we going to tell our loved ones, I kept God in the background for way too long. I wasted so much time doing so many other things. I wish I would have spent more time with Him. I can't answer that for you. But you know. You know that answer right now. So I urge you to think about these things. At the end of the day, where are your priorities? Are they with God, or are they in this world? And so as we offer the invitation, I want to urge you to think about the things that last through this life. I want to urge you to think about the things that grant eternal life and that can only be found in that relationship with God and His Son, Jesus Christ. And so if you're not a Christian, this is the time where we say, you can find that relationship. You can repent of your sins. You can join Him in the waters of baptism. You can start growing towards, Jesus says, investing in the things that are important. But for those of us who are Christians, take this time to think, am I investing in the things that are important? I know you're here. It's a Sunday morning, and you're probably feeling pretty good about yourself because you're here. But is that continuing on for the rest of the week? Where are you focusing your energy? What are you talking about? What are you thinking about? Are you building for this life? Or are you building for the next one? And if there's any way we can help you recalibrate, if we can pray with you, pray for you, we'd love to help you. Feel free to come to the front.